All right, now we're going to solve quadratic equations by what we call completing the square. Now we have 5 steps to follow, and we will follow those 5 steps. But first I want to talk about what our goal is in completing the square. What we want is to get our quadratic in the form of x plus some value, and I'm just going to call it h. All right, that whole quantity squared equal to some other value, some other constant, and we'll just call that k. And that's because if we get it in that form, all right, we can then apply the square root principle, where we take the square root of both sides. So we take the square root of the left side, and that's going to equal the square root of the other side, and we'll have that plus or minus out in front. Okay, and then that's going to allow us to solve for x, because we would end up with x plus h, all right, we square root undoes the squaring, equals plus or minus square root k, and then to get x, right, we subtract h from both sides. Okay, that is the goal of these 5 steps, right, is to get our quadratic in this form. So I want to remind us of sort of the general form of a quadratic, and that is we use a for the leading coefficient, the coefficient on the x squared term. We use b as the coefficient on the x term, and we use c as the constant term. Okay, so let's look at an example and run through these 5 steps. So let's take x squared minus 10x minus 7 equals 0. So our first step is we want to move that constant to the other side. So step 1, move the 7. So to move the 7, we're going to add 7 to both sides. So we end up with x squared minus 10x equals 7. All right, now we go to step 2, and we take b, which is the coefficient on the x term. So in this case, it's negative 10. Divide that by 2. We get a negative 5, and take negative 5 and square it. So that gives us 25. So we take that 25, we're going to add it to both sides of the equation. So if we do the same thing on both sides, we keep the equal sign. Okay, I'm going to draw a line here to separate out where we're doing the work and kind of the steps. Okay, our next step is where we can write it in this form. And I'm just going to put this here. We can add the 7 and the 25. We get 32. And we can now add something to that x. And what we add to that x is this number that we got when we divided b by 2. So it's a negative 5. So plus a negative 5 or just minus 5. Okay. And that gets us to the goal of completing the square. So from here on out, we are using the square root principle to solve. So to solve, we are going to now use the square root principle. I'm going to abbreviate here a little bit, or the square root property. Okay, take the square root of both sides. Right, got to remember our plus or minus out in front of that 32. So we are left with, on the left, we just have x minus 5 because the square root undoes the squaring. And we want to simplify that square root of 32. So 32 can be written as a factors of 16 times 2. So if we take a square root of 16, we get 4, and the 2 stays underneath the square root. All right, and then finally we can add 5 to both sides. So if we're adding 5 to both sides, we get x is equal to 5 plus or minus 4 square root 2. And those are our two solutions. So remember, we've got two solutions here. We've got the positive case, x equals 5 plus 4 square root 2. And we've got x equals 5 minus 4 square root 2. And we cannot simplify those anymore because one has that square root 2 and the other doesn't have a square root, so they just stay like that. Okay, let's look at this example. We're needing to add a preliminary step here because you'll notice that the leading coefficient is not a 1. Okay, in other words, a is -3, it's not 1. And to do completing the squared method, we want leading coefficient to be 1. So to get it to be 1, we need to divide all the terms by whatever a is, whatever that leading coefficient is. So divide all terms by, and I'm just going to make this general, by a, and then let's go ahead and do that for this quadratic. So we're just dividing everything by 3, and if we rewrite what that's going to look like, for the first term we end up with just x squared. For the second term, 12 divided by -3, we get a -4, so we get -4x, and a -9 divided by -3 is going to be a +3. Okay, so now we can continue on with the rest of the steps. So step 1, we want to move the 3 to the other side, so we subtract 3 from both sides. And now we take b, which in this case is the -4. So -4, and we're dividing that by 2. So we get -2. Then we're going to square that. So we get a +4. All right, so now you remember that's what we add to both sides. All right, that allows us now to write the left side in that form that we want to write it in. And we can combine those terms on the right side and we just get a +1. So we end up with x, and remember what we're putting in there is what we got when we divided b, or -4 by 2, so -2. So that's going to end up being a -2, just like that. Okay, so that gets us to where we want to be because now we can take the square root of both sides to solve for x. So that gets us x minus 2 equals plus or minus square root 1, which is just 1. And then to get x by itself, we add 2 to both sides. X equals plus or minus 1. So we can actually write down what those numbers are. 2 plus 1 is 3. 2 minus 1, we get 1.